10 seconds. 2, 1.
Hello, I'm Pierre Thomas, ABC News Senior Justice Correspondent. I'm joined today by the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Rod Rosenstein, and we're here to talk about the opioid crisis. Rod, thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you. Good to have you here.
Right. 64,000 people died of overdoses. That's the preliminary figure for 2016. Roughly 48,000 of those opioid related. How would you describe the magnitude of what we're experiencing?
It's an extraordinary epidemic and really a crisis that has been building for some time. We saw it begin with fentanyl about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's now reached an epidemic proportion.
And why do you think we've gotten here? It seems to be getting worse and worse. There's been a lot of calls for action. It's been in the public domain, but why does it seem to be getting worse?
When we talk about the opioid crisis, we're really talking about a multifaceted problem. You have heroin, which is traditionally a drug that has caused a lot of death and devastation in the United States, but it's been fueled in recent years by the diversion of oxycodone and other legitimate opioid drugs, and also in the last 3 or 4 years by the rise of fentanyl, which is an illicit substance that is imported from China. And those factors all together have contributed to this extraordinary death toll that we've seen in recent years.
Now, you recently were a U.S. Attorney for Baltimore. That city has a long-standing opioid problem, heroin problem in particular. Why haven't the federal efforts, the local efforts around the country stopped this explosion?
Well, I think it's a matter of degree. You know, the heroin problem, as you mentioned, has long been a problem in Baltimore. But there was a fair amount of law enforcement, and we had it somewhat under control until about 3 or 4 years ago, when we started to see this rise of deaths attributable to fentanyl. And I think that's what's largely fueled the increase in recent years. We have of the approximately 64,000 deaths in 2016 attributed to drug overdoses, about 20,000 of those, so almost a third, are a product of fentanyl. And that's something that's relatively new. Just 3 or 4 years ago, there were only about 2,500 deaths that were attributed to fentanyl. So that has really fueled the rise.
It is part of the problem that people understand how dangerous and powerful and potent fentanyl is. My mother recently died of cancer, and she had to use fentanyl prescribed by a doctor, obviously, to ease the pain. And it was very controlled in terms of the amounts that she could get. Give people a sense of why this is so dangerous.
Yeah, fentanyl really describes a class of drugs, not just one particular drug. And that's part of the challenge, is that the fentanyl that people are using, that they're getting illicitly, either ordering it through mail over the internet or buying it from local street dealers, they have no control over the dosage. So they don't know exactly what they're getting. They don't know what concentration they're getting. And so they don't have the ability to regulate the dose. And just a few grains of pure fentanyl can actually cause death. And so it's extraordinarily dangerous for that reason.
Now, we've seen people going out, law enforcement, they have to wear suits, biohazard suits, to deal with the issue. That gives people a sense of what we're talking about here?
That's right. You know, that approach started with meth a few years ago. And in recent months in particular, DEA has made a point of emphasizing to law enforcement how important it is to exercise caution when you're dealing with white powder substance, because there can be fentanyl mixed in with it. Even if it's not pure fentanyl, it could be spiked with fentanyl, and it can be very hazardous to responding officers.
It's like playing Russian roulette.
It can be, that's right.
A number of years ago, we saw, as you said, fentanyl come into being. We've interviewed fire and rescue people from around the country. And I've been struck by people talking about how addicts will literally nearly die from an overdose and then get up and then want the drug. The addiction level and the problem, have you seen anything like that?
Well, no. I think that's one of the reasons why this opioid epidemic is so dangerous. Because once people are addicted, it's a very powerful addiction. And so even people who go through very effective treatment programs often will relapse because of the impact that fentanyl has on the human brain. And that's why the most important thing to know about heroin and fentanyl is to avoid getting started in the first place. Because once you're hooked on this stuff, it's very difficult to wean yourself away.
Now, you made an announcement today concerning some arrests and charges emanating from China. China, give us a sense of their role in this process. And 2 Chinese nationals were arrested or charged as a part of these indictments today. Are you getting enough help from the Chinese? Are they doing anything to support you? I understand you recently went to China. Are you getting enough support from them?
That's right. As I mentioned, my first experience with fentanyl goes back about 3 years to when it first came to my attention in Maryland. And one of the first questions we asked is, where is this coming from? Because most of the drugs that we deal with are grown, they're plants. Opium, for example. Fentanyl is not. It's a chemical. It's produced in a lab. And the fentanyl that we see in the United States is believed to all be coming in some way from China. In some cases, it's manufactured in China and then shipped either through the mail or through other countries to the United States. In other instances, the precursor chemicals actually come from China, and the fentanyl may be manufactured in Mexico, for example, but it's all sourced to China. And one of the challenges we face is that because fentanyl is a chemically produced drug, it's produced in a lab, if we prohibit a particular type of fentanyl, particular molecular construction, the chemist can just make a slight modification so that the new version is not identical to the previous version. And so the chemists, the labs are staying a step ahead of us in that respect.
So the Mexican cartels are getting their precursor drugs from China by and large?
Some of it's produced in Mexico, but we believe the majority of it is actually produced in China and then shipped here to the U.S.
Now, what's the Chinese response been to your overtures to get them to do more?
Well, the Chinese have been cooperative. And as you mentioned, I was there 2 weeks ago, and I met with some of the leading Chinese law enforcement officials, and they have been very accommodating to us. They've been assisting us in conducting these investigations. But the challenge that we face is that these fentanyl derivatives or analogs that are being produced in China are not illegal in China. And so what we've talked to them about is scheduling the precursor chemicals and perhaps even scheduling all types of fentanyl so that you can prohibit the production of those drugs in China, because the situation now is that some of these labs can operate legally in China, although they're violating U.S. law when they ship it here. So we're grateful for the support we've gotten from China so far, but we're hoping that they'll step up now that we've demonstrated that Chinese nationals are sending this poison and causing deaths in the United States. We hope that they'll provide even more help.
The two charged today, any sense that they are going to lock those guys up for you and send them here?
We don't know exactly what the Chinese are going to do. Our relationship with China is such, we don't have an extradition treaty, and so typically China would not send Chinese nationals to the United States for prosecution, but they might be willing to hold them accountable there and pursue charges in China. And so we're going to share the evidence with them, and our DEA has a very good relationship with the Chinese Ministry of Public Security. We're going to share information with them, and hopefully they'll take action in China.
We saw some news reports over the weekend about some laws that were changed last year that make it more difficult for DEA to track opioid shipments. Are you concerned about that, and do you agree with the decision by the nominee for the drug czar to step out of the process?
Well, with regard to the regulation of the drug, I think it's important to recognize this is primarily handled administratively by DEA. And so the Justice Department lawyers get involved in that if there's a challenge to a DEA action. As U.S. Attorney, I was involved in helping DEA enforce those regulations against a number of pharmaceutical companies. And when we handled those cases under the Controlled Substances Act, we would obtain settlements that typically involved, in part, a financial settlement with the drug manufacturers and distributors, but also in part a stipulation, a promise by them to regulate their conduct in the future. And so I think that's a very effective tool. This issue that was identified over the weekend with regard to the statutory change is a new issue to me. I've discussed it with the DEA Acting Administrator, Rob Patterson. We're going to look into it and try to evaluate what impact it's having. The administrator mentioned that DEA still has other tools that it can use to regulate the improper distribution of opioid drugs. So we're going to have to look into that and figure out whether or not they have the tools they need. And if they need new tools, we'd certainly support that.
What's it going to take? I mean, the death level from this, young people, old people, middle class, upper class, all kinds of people. What do you need to see to begin to stem this tide?
Well, we think about controlling drugs in really three ways. In prosecution, which is the most important tool that the Justice Department wields, but also prevention and treatment. And I think we need to focus on all three of those. We're focusing, with regard to fentanyl in particular, we're focusing on prevention. How can we prevent fentanyl from being imported in the United States? And how can we train people, teach people about the dangers that it poses to them? And so the more we're able to get out the word about these risks, I think the more effective we're going to be in stopping people from experimenting with fentanyl, from ordering it over the internet, and from testing it. If they realize just how dangerous this substance is, hopefully they'll be deterred from starting down that road.
Now, the president announced yesterday he's going to have a written declaration making the opioid crisis a national emergency. What does that mean? Does that mean more money for the DEA? Does that mean more money for treatment? There's been a Syracuse report saying that federal prosecutions of drugs is way down. Any truth to that?
So you've asked me a number of questions. With regard to the import of the announcement that the president expects to make, I'm going to let him announce exactly what that's going to mean. But certainly it's going to mean, I believe, enhanced focus on opioid addiction, ways to prevent it. With regard to drug prosecutions, though, that's something that we've been very candid about. This administration is committed to responding to the crime problem. If you see a 50% increase in drug overdose deaths, as we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years, you need to increase enforcement. That's not the only solution. It's not just about prosecution, but that's got to be part of the solution. And so we're emphasizing enforcement, but not just volume of enforcement. We're emphasizing that we need to prosecute the right people. And so we've talked with assistant U.S. attorneys and agents around the country about focusing their cases on the drug suppliers, not just the local distributors, but the high-level suppliers. And that's part of what led to the cases we announced today.
Now, you've got a complex situation unfolding with sanctuary cities, where some of these cities say that they do not want to cooperate. And there's been discussion of taking away some federal funding. Some of those same cities have an opioid problem. How are you going to thread that needle and give them the support they need or not?
I think these are, to some extent, distinct problems. I mean, with regard to drug enforcement, those drug enforcement resources of the DEA are not affected by those policies. So we're continuing, as we have been, to combat drug distribution everywhere in the country, particularly when it's linked to either overdose deaths or violence.
Okay, I think we have time for a few more questions. The horror of Las Vegas, horrific, so many lives lost. Can you give us an update on anything about motive, anything about accomplices at this point?
It would be inappropriate for me to be making announcements about that. We're supporting the local law enforcement authorities in their investigation, but it's primarily their responsibility to manage disclosure of public information about it. And I think it's important for us to respect that. So what I can tell you is, obviously that tragedy has affected everybody. When you think about the impact on not only the victims who were killed and their families, but the many who've been injured, some of whom are still in hospitals. So we are doing what we can to support them. ATF and FBI have been supporting them from the very start, helping to conduct that investigation, make sure we identify anybody that the suspect may have been associated with, try to determine what may have been his motivation. And so we're going to do everything we can to support that work.
Both the local sheriff and the FBI did say no evidence so far of anyone supporting him, and no information about a clear motive at this point. Is that where things stand as far as you?
Well, that's one of the most important things that they're looking into. Obviously, the first thing you want to make sure is, have you identified everybody who was involved in the scheme? Everybody who's potentially accountable. Was there any criminality associated with the acquisition of the weapons, for example? And so those are the issues that they're looking into.
The bump stock issue. Is ATF done with its review? And what is your position on whether these bump stocks, exploit the spirit of what lawmakers and really the country intended in terms of not having weapons fire at the pace nearly of a machine gun?
Well, ATF is conducting that review, as I know we've announced publicly. No, we haven't completed it. But as I know you recognize, ATF's responsibility is to enforce the laws as they're passed by the Congress. And so ATF does have some ability to regulate, to adopt regulations that are consistent with the statutory provisions passed by Congress, but they're operating under those restrictions. So that's what regulates ATF. They enforce the laws as they're written.
So do we know yet if this is a legislative fix or an executive fix?
If you wanted to prohibit bump stocks, which I think is what you're getting at, we're going to complete that ATF review and then we'll announce our conclusion.
Okay. Special Counsel Probe, you were, I believe, interviewed by the Special Counsel's team. What's your status in terms of overseeing the investigation? Are you still overseeing it, and do you see that changing in the near future?
So I'm not going to comment on who was or was not interviewed, and I think I've been pretty clear about this in all my public statements. we conduct investigations in the Department of Justice in a particular way. We conduct them in private. We don't publicize the investigations while they're ongoing. So I know there's been a lot of speculation about this, but we're still abiding by, when I say we, the folks who are actually conducting the investigation and supervising the investigation, we're following the rules. And the rules are we don't comment about it. So I don't have anything to say about that.
Okay. Well, we thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. That is it for us here. You can find more about breaking news on the ABC News app. Please turn to that. Thank you so much.